well as a kind of like summary or coda. But they also changed quite a bit during the writing of the book and during the project of discovery. And that is the writing process. And what I wanted to do with you today is to give you a kind of sense of the general argument of the book and what I'm trying to do in it, to go over these, and then also to a certain extent open up some questions based on these 11 theses or 11 ideas in the book for what they mean for us in the present moment of anti-capitalist struggle, which, as we were discussing before the session started, it feels like the best of times and the worst of times. I mean, it is very abundantly clear that the ruling class in its various factions are very worried. But as so often happens, when the ruling class becomes worried, it's a very dangerous moment. So we were talking about the recent policies of the Conservative government in the UK, cracking down on anti-capitalist speech in schools. Of course, in the United States, we're seeing a massive sort of villainization of left-wing movements and ideas. But that, on some level, must also indicate that this is a moment of profound potentiality and possibility. And I think we need, we're seeing in the United States, in the very belly of the beast, for instance, a huge amount of radical mobilization, and really around the world, a new generation, I think, of young people who are very excited about radical ideas and anti-capitalist ideas. And it's certainly something I didn't really expect to see at this moment, but it's very, I don't know, I think it's very hopeful. So in a weird way, I can't decide whether the book that I've written, Revenge Capitalism, The Ghost of Empire, The Demons of Capital, and the Settling of Unpayable Debts, came at exactly the right time or exactly the wrong time. On one level, I think that the general idea of the book, which is that capitalism has descended into a system that seems to be taking needless, warrantless revenge on people and the planet, seems appropriate. It seems to describe something about the particularly irrational character of capitalism, which claims, of course, to be a perfectly rational system. I think it helps us also explain the rise of political revanchism, especially on the far right, where you have the development of these kind of right-wing parties and tendencies that, for all intents and purposes, appear to promise no great, better future, in spite of the claims they're going to make America great again or return Britannia to its great exalted place at the head of the empire. They do seem to promise their adherents a kind of political revenge, ironically against people who least deserve it, which is to say poor people, working class people, racialized people, feminists, queer people. So all that seems to have come at the right time. I feel happy on one level that seems to be an accurate reflection of what's happening right now. I feel very unhappy that is an accurate reflection of what's happening right now, because I wish it were otherwise. But then I also feel that in my last month of teaching, since we've been back at school here in Canada, I've noticed quite a shocking shift in my lectures and the guest lectures that I've done amongst students who are between sort of 18 and 20, which is that now a lot of these things feel, if not, I don't know whether the term would be obvious, but self-evident maybe. And it makes me very hopeful that I think there is a growing awareness among people that capitalism has reached its end point, its end game. But I'm curious about what that means and whether that awareness goes beyond slogans. And it's one of the reasons I'm so glad for groups like those that many of you are part of, that not only seek to mobilize, but also to explore ideas and explore these ideas more deeply and mobilize around them, which I can't say how important it is in this moment. Okay, so yes, what I was going to do here is just go over these 11 theses in the next sort of 20 minutes or so, and then I'd love to hear what you have to think and reflections on them or questions too. So the first reflection or thesis that kind of sums up the whole book is that revenge is the reckless determination that what you love has value in a world where it is rendered worthless. And this, I feel, in some ways is the observation I'm most attached to, for a number of reasons. First, I think in a book about revenge, which also explores the politics of anti-capitalist revenge, I wanted to begin with love, and I wanted to begin with value, as I think Marx also did in a certain way in his early work. And I wanted to begin with the idea that this striving for a kind of what I eventually call an avenging, a desire to avenge the crimes and cruelties of capital and create a different world, stems from holding fast to that which you love rather than holding fast to that which you abhor. But it's holding fast to those things that you love that within the capitalist system are rendered worthless. And this could be, as the image indicates, it could be nature itself, this thing we call nature, that we, we have an error when we consider nature separate from humanity. But the natural world, the more than human world, to witness its destruction fills many of us with a sense of incredible rage. But that rage is built on a love of the incredible interdependency and complexity of natural systems. But I think it's beyond that too. I think that we're seeing in a lot of the most powerful movements of our age against capitalism, the mobilization around love of people's community, love of families, love of people who've been historically devalued by capitalism. Capitalism, I think, systematically devalues or revalues everything of value in the world. Of course, on a basic level, replacing their pragmatic use values with exchange value. But I think that basic Marxist formula only captures a small part of it, because it also relies upon the systemic and structural devaluation of certain people's lives, of people of color's lives, of queer people's lives, of workers' lives, that makes and is now reaching a moment where it is threatening to make somewhere, by some estimates, between 50 and 80% of humanity essentially redundant to its own operations of producing profit. So living through a moment of profound and deadly devaluation of human life, I feel like I keep coming back to this idea that revenge has to, on some level, a good kind of revenge, and what I call an avenging, will need to come back to and always sort of begin and end with this kind of radical love. The second main idea in the book that recurs a number of times is that when you live in somebody else's utopia, all you have left is revenge. And that's not necessarily because you have no options for resistance other than a kind of bloody struggle against domination, although that is often the case. And I think we can take the example of uprisings of enslaved people as an example, in the US South, for instance, or the British Caribbean colonies. The colonists and slaveholders had built their own utopia using stolen labor, as do capitalists today. And within that utopia, there's no space for resistance other than in some ways destroying that utopia. But it's also to say that if for the inhabitants, for the citizens of utopia, when there is an uprising against utopia, no matter how gentle or how civil that uprising, it will always be interpreted by the utopians as revenge, because within their thought world, all resistance to utopia is revenge. It's nothing more than the kind of bestial spasm of the mob. And so I wanted to highlight this kind of observation from the book, because I think it helps us understand the way that social movements throughout capitalism's history have been, and this is one of the things I try and show in the book through a number of chapters, have been sort of defamed as vengeful. So working class uprisings of the colonized have always been labeled by the ruling class as pathologically, subhumanly vengeful. When, of course, and this is a theme that we'll come to in a second, it is in fact those systems of domination that are vengeful. It is those systems that are pathologically violent. Oppression is held in place by the preemptive revenge of the powerful, which is justified as a precaution against the fantasized vengeance of the oppressed. And the image you see on the right here is from a comic book that we've commissioned that just was finished to translate one of the chapters of Revenge Capitalism, which is about the opioid crisis in the United States and traces it back to the Opium Wars and the ways of the entanglements of capitalism, imperialism, and racism historically and in the present day. So in a sense, my argument throughout the book is that systems of domination, including capitalism and especially capitalism, act vengefully. They act vengefully for two reasons. One of them is they act vengefully as a way to repress struggle. So we have a long history from the Peterloo massacre all the way up to the police response to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations of the state at the behest of capital, or private mercenaries at the behest of capital, taking revenge upon people who are struggling as a way to send a message that struggle will be met with ruthless vengeance. But on another level as well, those systems themselves are vengeful. And so there's a great quotation from Marx where he talks about the so-called Sepoy mutiny in the 1840s in India, the uprising against British rule that was instigated by a mutiny of Sepoy soldiers. And he says, and in England at that time, the government had used it as an opportunity to whip up kind of nationalist mob mentality to support incredibly brutal crackdowns against not only Indians in India, but also so-called foreign populations in England as well, in Britain as well. And Marx observes that, no matter what the sepoys did during that war of independence, as it's now remembered in India, it was only a kind of reflection of the normalized everyday vengeance of the British colonial system under the East India Company at that time. That somehow the economic system that had kept so many Indian people essentially in a moment of hyper-exploitation, that subjected them to horrific famines and other destruction of, and enslavement of a whole civilization. That was the real vengeance we should be thinking about. A topic that was taken up again, though using a slightly different language, by, for instance, Frantz Fanon. And yet, in spite of the fact that that capitalism and other systems of domination act vengefully, they masquerade or mask this vengeance by blaming precisely those whom they oppress and exploit as pathologically and insatiably vengeful. And they normalize their policing of those populations with recourse to this idea that if they lifted their thumb for a moment, or they lifted their shoe from the neck of the oppressed for a moment, that the oppressed would rise up with a kind of apocalyptic vengeance. But that vengeance which the oppressor imagines is always a kind of misrecognized reflection or refraction of their own vengeful nature. As a result, capitalism has always presented itself to the public in its preferred mythology as having banished revenge to the borderlands. But in fact, revenge is at the core of the capitalist system, and it's revealed most clearly in its moments of crisis. So most famously in 1980, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we had the kind of era of hyper-capitalist triumphalism associated with what Mark Fisher talks about as capitalist realism, the so-called end of history. And in Fukuyama's influential theory of the end of history, and others who are less intelligent than Fukuyama, who's quite an interesting person to read, in spite of the fact one disagrees with him completely. The idea was that finally humanity had overcome the war of all against all that is characteristic of human politics, and that under pax capitalis, under the peace of the market, humanity would now be able to enter into the future unhindered by the dark spirits of revenge. That if you were a person who was envious or acquisitive or competitive, good, you could exercise those dispositions in the arena of the free market without doing anyone any harm. And in fact, if you exercise those ambitions within the market, you would be benefiting everyone, because ultimately you would be driving forward progress and change and innovation and all of those other good things. So capitalism has claimed, it is also claimed, for instance, that the limited electoral democratic system that it offers us, which is, to be fair, the result of generations of class struggle, but which capitalism claims as its own unique gift. It claims that that system has also allowed us in the realm of politics to overcome the specter of human revenge, which otherwise has haunted human civilization. And yet the argument in my book is that if we actually look at what's happened over that period, capitalism, driven by its own internal contradictions, has become a system that is more vengeful than almost any other. And within that, I include, extremely vengeful systems of the past, including feudalism or the kind of historical theocracies that would practice acts of revenge on the population as explicitly, public executions, public torture. I actually argue in the book that in some ways capitalism is more vengeful, more vindictive, but, and this point we'll come back to in a moment, without any single person necessarily taking responsibility or being sort of ordering the deaths. So you can have a system, for instance, that horrifically allows tens of thousands of people fleeing their homes to drown in the Mediterranean, or to be murdered for sport on the American border by paramilitaries, or to starve to death or for lack of clean water, simply because they happen to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet all of those deaths from the system itself, the kind of way that the system takes revenge, or through, for instance, the incredible violence that will be unleashed by climate change, all of that is erased from the ledgers. And so you have, mainstream, allegedly left-wing thinkers, allegedly, like Steven Pinker, write a whole book about how actually humanity has become much more peaceful in the last 30 or 40 years than ever before, the better angels of our nature. That completely erases from the ledger all of these systemic and structural deaths, and as a result is essentially little more than propaganda for a current capitalist system. The fifth point is that whereas all systems of oppression do take vengeance against those whom they oppress, capitalism is unique in that the vengeance emerges from the contradictions of the system itself without any necessary malice or hatred having to be operative. Revenge is the outcome of capitalism in this moment rather than the motive of capitalism. And I think this is a point that there's often mistaken about the book. And I think it happens because most of the readers in the Anglophone world come from cultures that are highly individualistic. And we've been habituated over the last decades to think only really about individuals as creating history and movement in the world. Whereas if we have a systemic imagination and we understand how systems work, we can begin to see that, in fact, something like revenge can be used as an explanation for the outcome of a system rather than necessarily the motivating force of everyone inside it. And second, I think the mistake that often worries me is that people think that this vengeance of capitalism has to do with the kind of conspiracies of elites in their office towers, sort of cackling together to pull the wool over people's eyes and create a world of human sacrifice. And to a certain extent, we know that's true. I mean, we do know that there are what could very plausibly be called conspiracies among elites. They do meet together. Some of them even have an understanding of what's good for the capitalist class as a whole rather than what's good for them. And some of them are ideologically disposed in certain directions. But really, I think it's important to go back to this lesson from Marx that I think is so well expressed and articulated in the work of someone like David Harvey, that really shows us that how capitalism moves and what it does is driven not by the conspiracies of the elites and of the capitalist class, but by the way that their competition with one another leads them into fatal contradictions within the system. And then there needs to be a fix for those contradictions. And that fix produces more contradictions and more crises. And there's another fix and another fix and another fix. This, for instance, helps us explain what I see as one of the major forms of capitalist vengeance in our moment, which is climate change and the incredibly anti-human and anti-natural effects that will have, in spite of the fact that other than a handful of like really stereotypical Bond villain-esque capitalists, most capitalists don't even want this to happen, but they seem unable to create the kind of class alliances that would actually allow them to stop climate change. And in fact, the competition between each nation state around the world to prevent themselves from having to pay the costs or prevent their capitalist class from having to pay the costs of some sort of carbon transition is precisely the kind of contradiction that means that that revenge emerges as the effect of the system rather than the intention of the system. I hope that's kind of clear. The sixth observation is that revenge politics, the revenge politics to which revenge systems give rise often take mistaken targets, in part because these systems mask their own vengeance as economic necessity, peaceful justice, or human nature. So to the extent that capitalism suggests in that kind of end of history narrative that it is the absolute human horizon of justice, peace, and necessity, it even advertises itself as the culmination of human nature itself and the final answer to how humans can organize themselves. To the extent that it makes us believe that those myths are true, it encourages people to mistakenly identify who is responsible for their misery, who is responsible for the effects of capitalism taking revenge on them. And unfortunately, this leads to, of course, as we're seeing across on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the world, the incredible success of far-right reactionary and neo-fascist parties who are able to take the incredibly horrifying effects of capitalism and find convenient scapegoats to blame. On the right, you have the panel from the comic book I mentioned before. That chapter goes into the very interesting statistic that one of the best predictors of if counties in the United States would switch their vote from Barack Obama in 2012 to Donald Trump in 2016 was the rise in so-called deaths from despair. These are deaths from opioid overdoses, suicide, and alcoholism. And I, in that chapter, tried to show the way that, you know, the opioid epidemic especially is entangled with a long history of capitalism's use of drugs to pacify workers, is entangled with a long history of imperialism and racism. And for a long time in American history, for 150 years at least, drug panics, which are in fact caused by capitalism or as workers, for instance, try and escape the incredible damaging effects of capitalism on their bodies and minds and turn to illicit narcotics. These drug crises have been successfully turned around by reactionary forces and blamed on foreigners, so-called foreigners. And in the panel you see there, Chinese workers who were brought over after the destruction of the Chinese economy by British and American opium imports, who came to America to help, for instance, build the railroad to enable settler colonialism and resource extraction on American land, and who are also then a very profitable target for white supremacist capitalist forces to mobilize the anger of working class white Americans, not against capitalism, but against the racial other, so to speak. The history and present of revenge capitalism cannot be disentangled from other vengeful systems, including patriarchal gender terrorism, genocidal colonial brutality, and slavery. I think this point is fairly clear from what I've previously said. The only reference I would make here is towards the witch trials and the destruction of women's power in the early modern period that has been so amazingly sort of mapped out by Silvia Federici and other Marxist feminists over the last few decades. The witch trials, I think, are a great example of the way that the ruling class, as they were destroying an old way of life of the peasants and transforming the European peasantry into the what would become the proletariat, and transforming the working class through incredible violence and dispossession, was able to mobilize patriarchal vengeance against women as its kind of alibi or its distraction. Very, very successfully, and the incredibly long reach of that shadow into our present day, including kind of the establishment and the entanglement of the capitalist wage relation with patriarchal social relations, the incredible control over sexuality, and so on. Now I sort of move in these last three observations to what I anticipate will be some of the responses to revenge capitalism, where I do argue ultimately that we need to embrace what I call an avenging imaginary, which I'll describe in a minute, and the kind of fear that that evokes in all of us. And I want to honor that fear. I think it's a legitimate and useful fear, but one that I disagree with and I want to challenge. Partly it's that I think a weird part of the capitalist ideology in the last, especially over the neoliberal period, has become what I call reconcilophilia, or a love of reconciliation, a love of and a certain fetishization of imagined peacemakers, specifically organized around the kind of strangely reanimated zombie-like figures of Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. These representations of these three figures are sort of stripped of all the complexity that all three revolutionaries had in their time and place, and they're simply sort of trotted out in film and fiction and television and nonfiction as these kind of beneficent icons of forgiveness. So in the 8th point, I write that the easy condemnation of revenge is usually the narcissism of the privileged. Revenge is not a dark cloud on the horizon, it is already upon us. Condemning it, in fact, is futile. The task is to foment an avenging imaginary for revolutionary transformation. Those with power and privilege want to imagine that transitions can be peaceful. And I hope that they are. I genuinely, I'm not in any way a violent person. I genuinely hope, and all of my activism is nonviolent. But I want to question where we learned to fear revenge. And I want to question how capitalism has come to define revenge for us. One of the arguments in the book is a discursive one, which is to say, I'm interested not only in what revenge is, but who gets to define what revenge is. Partly I want to do this in my book so I can say that capitalism as a system is taking revenge, not only individuals take revenge. Partly it's because I want to turn around this question of so-called populism, which, centrists, those who consider themselves centrists, I should say, would like to lump the right and the left together as both sort of like populists, and that's bad. And I sort of want to break that apart and ask deeper questions about it. But I also want to suggest, I began this book in earnest after the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the Brexit referendum. And I wanted to argue in some way that revenge in some ways is already upon us in society, that revenge is increasingly defining the political moment. And to the extent that whatever this thing is we might call the left simply wants to abandon it or say, this is a terrible thing, we should never think about revenge, let's return to like kind of the Care Bears after school special version of politics, I think we're really missing something very important about our moments. And that's why I suggest that in this book, we need to take this idea of revenge politics and see to what extent we can transform it into what I call an avenging imaginary, which doesn't forgive capitalism for its crimes and cruelties, but seeks to abolish it so that the power that it wields and the power that its beneficiaries wield can never be wielded again by anyone. This speaks to a point that the authors and beneficiaries of capitalism, they do have names and addresses. We know who many of them are. The richest people in the world, the people who have incredible power over the media, over political parties, over data now increasingly, over the financial world. But the trick about capitalism that Marx, and especially I think Engels, perhaps because he was himself a factory owner, were so eager to remind us of, is that every capitalist is ultimately immediately replaceable. That's the beauty of the system. Revenge capitalism's success rests in its ability to conscript all of us, or just maybe any of us, in one way or another. And that makes the system very dangerous because sure, I mean, you can have a revenge fantasy where we go and, people have in the past kidnapped and assassinated horrible capitalist people who've done terrible things. But that's really not going to change the system in any substantial way, because especially in a moment of financialization where capitalist firms and capitalist nation states are run not based on the decisions that are being made around those tables, but basically decisions that are being made by the generalized capitalized intelligence of the financial system writ large. If a capitalist or a CEO or even a politician did something different than what they are already doing, they can expect to be removed and replaced almost immediately. So we need to, when we're thinking about revenge and avenging, I think we need to think more deeply about how we would avenge ourselves, not upon individuals, which both for moral and political reasons is probably a bit of a dead end, but actually avenge ourselves upon a system that is taking revenge. In spite of that, I want to offer a quick warning that sometimes, like, it's very easy to condemn the kind of revenge fantasies that circulate. And in the book, I take a lot of time to look at revenge fantasies as they circulate in popular culture. Things like Game of Thrones, Django Unchained, Quentin Tarantino, and other reality TV shows. But I do want to say that sometimes, it's easy to say, oh, you just have a revenge fantasy that you're never going to consummate or complete. And that's bad, whereas we smarter people have a revolutionary strategy. And of course, we do need revolutionary strategies rather than revenge fantasies. But I do make an argument in the book that sometimes revenge fantasy does lead to revolutionary strategy. And sometimes it's all that people have. And I think in understanding the affective politics of revenge capitalism now and what we have to contend with as organizers in our community, we need to somehow harness the power that revenge fantasies do have on a lot of people. They want revenge. They want revenge for what's been done to their life. And it behooves those of us who would turn that revenge towards some sort of systemic change, not just to say, well, your revenge fantasy is a terrible one and you should give it up, but to actually seek to explain and make irresistible the prospect of translating a revenge fantasy into a kind of what I call avenging imaginary, or a dream of abolition. And as I mentioned, I think what separates a revenge fantasy from an avenging imaginary is that a revenge fantasy, and I think this is the final point, a revenge fantasy keeps you locked in the thought world and power structures of the oppressor. It is an imagination that you will take the oppressor's power and then wield it for just and good ends. And if Lord of the Rings taught us nothing, it's that doesn't work, apart from all of the ideological problems with Lord of the Rings. But an avenging imaginary, I think, has a different view, which is to abolish the form of power that is leading to the oppression, not simply to use it for what are imagined to be nobler or better ends. And for me, that means not just, for instance, taking state power and wielding it to create some sort of socialist utopia. That actually requires that we reinvent power from the grassroots, through our relationships, through the way that we build new organizations of mutual aid and care. And through that, I think we begin to move towards an avenging, because avenging capitalism, avenging ourselves against capitalism, is not only about, like getting rid of this or that capitalist or stripping these capitalists of power. It's also about abolishing that within us that has been implanted by capitalism: the fear, the division, the individualism, the competitiveness, the way in which we're instructed to translate everything we value into something capital will value. All of those things and all of those relationships need to be rewoven. And I see that ultimately as a key part of this process of avenging, which in the book I'm trying to argue for. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Sorry,
that was wonderful. Thank you, Max. So we're going to obviously throw it open to the floor. So if anyone wants to raise their hands and make a short contribution, or ask Max a question, and we'll bring Max in during various parts of the rest of this evening to answer those questions or comment further. I hope that Max's talk has kind of whet your appetite, and you'll go out and purchase the book if you haven't. And I said at the beginning that it fizzes with ideas, because when you have a book that uses examples like Moby Dick, the Joker, we have Khloe Kardashian in there to explain these concepts. It's modern art to Steve Bannon. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. So enough of me talking anyway. So does anyone want to come in and either ask Max a question or make a short contribution? If so, you can raise your hand. No, not Susan. Go on. I know you would like to say something.
I really want to thank Max. This was incredibly interesting, and you sit there and you look at things. You try to pull. Been writing something on this relationship between the economic crisis, the political crisis, and the environmental crisis, and the way in which you put this together has, in terms of revenge capitalism, actually helps me to articulate some parts of the things that I was having trouble saying. I know it sounds it's because looking at what the system itself has done and what has derived, that has literally put us, a lot of people, this bizarre idea that, okay, there's going to be a crisis and it's over. Well, no, there won't be a crisis and it's over. We've seen this historically for a very long time in the absence of a subjective element. We're going to just keep on reliving and reliving as they come up with new, regimes of accumulation or whatever. But I really, and one of the things that I've noticed talking to people is how frustrated and upset they are, but they can't find a way to express it. And I found the way in which you described moving towards a avenging imaginary is a very helpful concept, and also a good description of the reality. So I want to thank you, because you've actually managed to give me a way of trying to approach this with people who are talking to me. So I just want to say thank you, actually. I'm sure other people have other questions. I thought it was very helpful. Thank you.
So glad. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to come in with a comment or to ask a question? Oh, it's very, very slow this evening.
It's a lot, I think. It's like...
Yeah, it's a lot to take in for people. Oh, yeah, no, Federico, we've got in the corner there. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Max, and thank you all for organizing this. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. It reminds me a bit of an essay I read a while ago by, I don't know how to pronounce their name, China Mieville, Social Sadism.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether revenge, did you consider using another term like sadism or brutality? Why revenge in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been reading China Mieville for years as a novelist. He's a great novelist. Writes what he calls weird fiction, and also a communist and fascinating writer. His book, The City in the City, I don't know if anyone's read it. I think it was actually adapted by the BBC recently. It's an incredible allegory for our moment. It takes place in two cities that are literally over top of each other, and the citizens in each of the cities, though they interact every day, are trained to unsee one another. And there's a secret police force that enforces the unseeing. It's really one of the, I think it's just an amazing allegory for so many things about what life is like in a world like ours and gentrifying cities, et cetera, et cetera. I had actually come across that article on social sadism after I finished the book, and then sort of slapped my head because I'm like, of course, China Mieville would have been there first. And I think there is a way that you could fruitfully, in my book, replace revenge with a word like sadism or a word like cruelty. And yet the thing that I wanted to do in the book is the book came out of my research onto financialization and debt and activism against financialization and debt. And the thing that revenge allows me to do is to think through how payback works and who owes whom. And the observation of, the late David Graeber, that it's so funny to say that. David Graeber's observation that debt has always been a weapon. We take it for this mathematical necessity, but it's always been a means by which oppression has been exercised and normalized through a kind of mathematical violence. And so the reason I came to revenge is I was thinking about the way that for a lot of people I know in the US and even in Canada, debt acts vengefully upon them. And it's a kind of vengeance because it presumes that they've done something wrong and now there needs to be punishment. Unlike sadism or cruelty, which is simply enacted for the kind of pleasure of the abuser. Revenge has a kind of gaslighting logic to it, which says, this is happening to you because you deserve it. And so I wanted to kind of wind back that tape and see what revenge is actually made of when it comes to thinking about things like debt. And I also wanted to a kind of the thing about sadism and cruelty is it wouldn't then help us explain why, for instance, the moment that we're in, for instance, in the United States, where the reactionary right has mobilized itself around the idea that Black people are being gunned down by police because they deserve it, that they did something wrong. There was some crime that happened in the past that now is going to be avenged. And this, you know, is the kind of dog whistle underneath all of the right-wing rhetoric around these deaths. Or, for instance, the idea that that we have, for instance, in recent discourse on the right in the UK and elsewhere, that migrants seeking to come to move are somehow guilty of some sort of crime and therefore deserve punishment. So the retributive logic is what attracted me. And if I'm honest, I feel I didn't quite get it as exactly as I wanted to in the book. But that's what kept on animating me to come back to that term rather than sort of sadism. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Sibezek, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up a bit on debt. And I tend to raise this quite a lot, and debt forgiveness in history, the pharaohs, etc. So is that a form of avenging imagery that you're looking for in present society? Because basically, it's completely based on debt, our society, and credit. And what we need to do is get the 1% to forgive all our debts, so that we can actually tackle the rest of the environmental problems and all the other things that we've got problems. And this is very much in the writing of Michael Hudson and his various books. So I just wanted you to elaborate on those similarities there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely in favor of eliminating the vast majority of personal debts, especially debts that people incurred for reasons of necessity, to go to university, to get a medical procedure, to get a house. Like, these are debts people should have never been forced to enter into to begin with. The one thing I would say about that, though, is I think I'm more in favor of debt abolition rather than debt forgiveness, because it just switches who's the agent. I think when we talk about debt abolition, we're talking about people rising up in a movement to say, we're not going to pay and we don't care what happens to you, the creditor. Whereas debt forgiveness is a kind of, we would be supplicating to the creditors who shouldn't be creditors at all. So I think in some way, like, rather than asking them to forgive debts, we should just abolish the 1%, so to speak, and abolish the system that enriched them. And the reason I say that is because it's not just ideological, although it's partly ideological. It's also strategic, because I've always had this kind of funny fantasy, which is that, like, imagine Donald Trump, let's just say, next week, realizing that he is about to lose the election, would say, I, Donald Trump, when elected, will eliminate the debts of all Americans, all the housing debt of all Americans who have never had a family member in that home in jail. So I don't think it's likely, but it is possible. He's a desperate man in desperate situations. In that circumstance, you would essentially have a massive boon to white voters, most of whom do not have family members in their homes that are in jail. And you would essentially intensify the racial division of wealth in American society. And this is just an example of what I worry about, which is, I think the idea of debt forgiveness, as you point out, and as Graeber pointed out, and Hudson has pointed out, and others, debt forgiveness throughout history has been used by many different regimes to save themselves, or by different factions within oppressive regimes to try and outmaneuver other factions. And I think there's a real risk if we just demand debt forgiveness that we might get what we're wishing for, but not under circumstances we would wish for.
Thank you, Max. Would anyone else like to come in with a question or a short statement they would want to make on the discussion so far? Do you have anybody else? Fred, would you like to come in?
Yeah, Max, I like your thing about, I'm enjoying reading your book. I'm only halfway through it, but it's great. And I like your thing about revenge being the only thing that some people can hang on to, but that can lead to strategy. And I think that's important because it reveals what the ruling class, the elites, between inverted commas, have, which is, they need to punish people before they put their head up above the parapet. A revolt, I mean, you've had them in America, we've had them in Britain, somebody gets arrested unjustly and, a whole neighborhood explodes, shops burn and so on and so forth. Hitting the wrong targets, obviously, right? And they don't explain that. The system doesn't explain that. The mainstream press and the elites don't explain that, except by saying, as you explain it, these are barbarians, who are basically criminals and terrorists. And maybe even though we've moved away, even though capitalism and Western Europe and North America have moved away from the period of medieval ages of torture and public executions and so on. Well, actually, I was listening to a program about the far right in America, and executions in America are still public because members of the victims who are killed can observe the execution of the murderer or alleged murderer, which in effect is a public execution. Right? So we haven't really moved away from the barbarism of the revenge, well, the obvious revenge capitalism that you talk about. But I just want to a friend of mine mentioned how the system is, or America and Trump is really going for Julian Assange. They really want to get him. I don't know Julian Assange. He might be a nice person, he might not be, but that's not the point, right? They really want to get him. They're going to make him suffer and lock him up in a hole in Guantanamo Bay or one of these supermax prisons and throw away the key. And and it's a warning to everybody who dares put their heads up. And even though the violence of early capitalism or feudal society is different today, it's still very much a violent society, very, very violent times in terms of, the pandemic, ecological crisis, wars, and so on and so forth. But maybe we don't see it so much here in Europe and North America because it's not as obviously violent as developing countries, parts of Africa, Asia, and so on. So maybe the distinction between, for people who are revolting, maybe the difference between revenge and avenging is not so important. I mean, it's basically, in a sense, there's not a moral justification for not being brutal when you seek to avenge yourself. And it's a difficult thing for us to imagine now because we live in a relatively depends where you are and who you are, right? But a relatively safer environment, right? But for people who live in which is most of the planet who live in a very violent system, then those moral dilemmas are not the same that we confront.
I mean, a few things there that I would add to. I mean, I think the problem is that the violence is systemic and structural. So it has to do with like people not having the necessities of life. And often what happens when people don't have the necessities of life is they turn on the people closest to them. So I sort of see the kind of violence that exists in poor communities, in ghettoized populations, that is also in some ways the violence of capitalism. Because it's essentially violence that is opportunistically thriving in a circumstance where people are incarcerated together. I think in terms of Assange, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example of of when the mask comes off and you have a real conspiracy of global elites who are like, we're going to make an example of this person and make him suffer to show our power and our displeasure. That said, I mean, I've been very impressed by the like Defend Assange movements. I'm disappointed that they have not taken the opportunity to make common cause with those movements that are fighting against migrant detention and against prisons, because ultimately it's the same struggle on some level. We understand Assange to be a political prisoner, but in a weird way, from an abolitionist perspective, all prisoners are political prisoners. They're, and certainly, the threat of deportation to a place where he is going to get an unfair trial and be abused would imply a solidarity then with all of those people in Yarlswood and other detention centers in the UK who are likewise going to be deported to places where they're going to be destroyed and abused. And I suppose the final point is I sometimes only get to mention it in passing, and but it's very central to me. So I live in a city called Thunder Bay, which is very small. It only has about 110,000 people in it, but it's Canada's racism and murder capital. And it's a place that's become very notorious recently for police abuse and premature death of Indigenous people who represent about, by the census, it's about 11 to 14% of the population. In reality, it's more like 20 or 25%. And I guess what a big part of the book, which comes across in certain chapters, but not necessarily directly, is my organizing work here with local police watch groups and volunteer street patrol and anti-colonial, anti-racist organizing. And I feel like being here has given me a kind of front row seat to see how colonialism is a kind of continuing process and how entangled it is with the processes of capitalist accumulation here. And then how violently that acts upon people in the community here, Indigenous people, especially in the community, not only in the form of police abuses, which are rampant, and non-Indigenous people murdering Indigenous people, which also happens here quite alarmingly, but also in terms of the violence that people within the Indigenous community enact upon each other because of years of colonial violence and the forms of substance abuse and trauma and sort of gang activity and other things that lead to such high rates of premature death for Indigenous people here, but that from the kind of in the racist imaginary that doesn't see the system is just like those people are killing each other over there. But what I was trying to explain in the book to myself about my own context was to recognize that all of those deaths that are happening here, which are happening at an extremely astronomical rate for Canada at least, are entangled in this vengeful history. It's almost like even though Canada is an official moment of so-called reconciliation with Indigenous people under the Trudeau administration. So this is partly where my loathing of reconcilophilia comes from. There is still this strange way that the system itself is taking this endless, needless, ongoing revenge against Indigenous people here. And I think that also helps explain, for instance, in the United States, where you could have the first Black president, during whose tenure the net worth of Black people in the United States declined and life expectancy declined as well. You can have these kind of illusions that the system is getting better in some way, but in fact, the revenge continues underneath.
Virginia's asked a question in the chat. So yeah, if you do want to ask a question, feel free to pop something in the chat and we'll read it out. That's not a problem. So Virginia's asked, what does revenge capitalism have to say about divide and rule?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's the classic strategy. I didn't really address it directly, but it seems to me to have a very clear connection, which is that, again, like if you live in a system that's constantly taking revenge on you through oppression and systemic injustice, you will be understandably filled with a kind of vindictive feeling, with revenge fantasies. And I think systems of power on some implicit level understand that, and their operatives then can easily mobilize that from one group against another. And I think, we're seeing that around the world right now with the far right resurgence, that this is a kind of divide and rule policy from capitalism as a whole, in which largely privileged people, often people associated with colonial forms of power, like those defined by race, are divided against workers of other backgrounds, and thereby more easily ruled. So I think divide and rule has always been there, and it's been a way in which the powers that be can point the finger at another group as the ones who are worthy of vengeance rather than the system itself. And of course, it's much easier to take revenge against other poor, working, or oppressed people than it is to take revenge against the system, which is much better armed, better funded, and has control over the thought world, in a sense that, revenge. And, I think about, my part of the book is also inspired by my own family history. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. And the preface to the book begins with a story about how he, after the Second World War, never wanted revenge against the Germans, oddly, which very much frustrated my father. But during the 1967 war, became, for reasons that my father could not understand, an ardent Zionist, very, very pro-Israel, very, very racist against Arabs. And my family since then has been sort of anti-occupation, anti-Zionist Jews. I bring this example up because I think it reveals how the divide and conquer thing works through a kind of misdirection of revenge. So in the first place, I think that, of course, the success of the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s was to point the finger away from the continued influence and power of the capitalist class, both nationally in Germany and internationally, and towards Jews and Roma people and communists and others as the real forces that had stabbed Germany in the back during the First World War and were leading to the incredible depression during the Weimar period. So there was a kind of misdirection of the vengeful angst of and it wasn't necessarily of the working class, at least initially in Weimar Germany. It was more of the petty bourgeoisie, people slightly wealthier than the working class. In any case, there's that, and then I also think that the anecdote from my own family history has something to reveal to us about the way in which the Zionist project was part of the end of empire. It was a part of the reformation of the world, where capitalism could rule directly without the intermediation of imperialist states. And so as part of that transition, establishing a Jewish settler colony in Palestine, I think was able to make itself feasible in part by a kind of divide and conquer strategy, where it encouraged, for instance, Jewish people like my grandfather to identify with the kind of nationalist aspirations of that were sort of bred and in the bone in imperialism and colonialism, and kind of anti-Arab racism that was also created at that time. It encouraged them to invest in that rather than invest in, for instance, many of the working class and revolutionary socialist traditions that had been the hallmark of Eastern European Jews, especially up to that point. And so again, I think that we have an example of sort of divide and conquer, where there were other possibilities in that moment, and what we got was a form of settler colonialism in Palestine that to this day continues to unleash incredible violence. It's kind of a long and rambling answer, but it's simply to say, yes, I think divide and conquer is key and is very much entangled with revenge.
We have another question from the chat. Sussy Oy, I hope I've got that right, in Bristol. Can you talk of any examples or experiences of activist practices that try to undo the individualized neoliberal inside ourselves? So
that's a great question. I think it's happening quite a bit in younger organizing, like the organizing we're seeing now, for instance, around the movement for Black Lives in the United States, in the resistance in Portland and other cities to kind of the incursions of the Trump regime. I know a tiny bit more about that, so I'll speak to that in this moment. But I think what I'll say, I hope will resonate with others from their experience. My sense is that a lot of these movements are developing ways to cultivate leaders and leadership within their organizations without elevating people to positions of authority. And it's a subtle distinction, but I think a really important one, in the sense that movement, I came of age in the 2000s in the anti-globalization movement, where there was also a very strong anti-leader ethos, but we made the mistake of assuming that A, you didn't need leaders, and B, that leaders wouldn't emerge anyway. And so we ended up with a bunch of leaders who were never accountable to the movements they were part of and didn't claim to be leaders. And I think what's different in this generation of struggle is that these are horizontal, open movements. They're organized in a more anarchistic fashion. I'm not necessarily saying that's a perfect answer to the problem, but I think what's happening is they're doing that recognizing that in previous moments, a lot of the leaders that have been elevated in previous movements have been easily co-opted in various ways, because that model of leadership and the model of sort of self-promotion and self-elevation is familiar to all of us from the kind of constant hustle of cognitive capitalism, where we all have to brand ourselves and sell ourselves and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the kind of new anti-authoritarian tendencies, I think, in these movements are ones that really want to value people's skills to be able to inspire and mobilize people, but then at the same time always return it to community-based decision makings, grassroots democracy. I see this a lot in the organizing we do here, because it's very much bicultural organizing. It's between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people who are working really hard to reclaim long, like centuries old Indigenous democratic traditions that colonialism sought to wipe out. So it's been very interesting for me on this point to work in communities where, some of us who come from kind of non-Indigenous capitalist backgrounds are ideologically trying to move beyond the way in which capitalism has instilled certain thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams in us. And then also to be working alongside and in solidarity with Indigenous folks for whom that is not a process of trying to invent something new, but rekindle something that has been lost. And many, not to go into the anthropology of it, but like many Indigenous civilizations here on Turtle Island or North America had these kind of traditions that I think are highly democratic on a grassroots level and really create structures within them to destroy hierarchy and authority where they find them, and to return to the question of the collective good rather than the sort of individual good. So it's been really interesting for me to observe that, but always observe it through a lens, because there's so much of it I just simply don't understand.
Yeah, I just got a little question for you. As a radical thinker and communicator, are you fearful of your voice being silenced, especially as we see a kind of creeping fascism and a rightward lurch in many countries? Are you fearful that your ideas could be silenced?
Yep. Yep. I think that's definitely a possibility. I mean, any of us who come from sort of radical perspectives do get harassment in like I'm a university professor, so we get harassment to our bosses from the public saying, we shouldn't be teaching blah, 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 blah. I think what we're seeing in the UK and the US are governments trying to create political mileage out of these kind of attacks on the left, like we're seeing with we were talking about the recent crackdowns on anti-capitalist ideas in public schools. In the United States, the university has become a key target of the far right, which is interesting to think about. I guess I feel on some level that I hope it doesn't happen, but if it does happen, I will take it as evidence that I'm doing something right. that somebody's worried. I mean, in a weird kind of way, I would be a little disappointed somehow if at some point somebody didn't try and silence the ideas that I and others are spreading, because it would mean that they're not important enough to try and silence. But I'm also cognizant that there's lots of consequences for that. And I also want to note that it's been interesting because I don't think that what I have to say is particularly original a lot of the time. It's been said in other ways, in other collections, and other formations by other people. And certainly a lot of my colleagues who are women or people of color have said very similar things or better things. And the amount of abuse and silencing that they suffer is astronomical compared to what I suffer. I mean, I've received a few death threats, but nowhere near like what most of my colleagues for doing things, that are much better than me get. So I also want to kind of note the weird ways in which this travels along the same lines of patriarchy and white supremacy. And as a white man, I guess people are not so offended that I would have something to say. I don't know, even if they disagree with it. Unclear.
No, that's a good answer. We're kind of rapidly running out of time, but Jara's asked a question and in the chat. He says, in your presentation and also elsewhere, you consistently speak of a system labeled as capitalism rather than capitalist production or the capitalist mode of production. Why is that?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I suppose it's because I'm trying to refer to capitalism not just in the way in which it extracts resources and surplus value from labor. I'm trying to speak about capitalism as it has evolved into a social totality, which includes not only its productive cycles, but also the sphere of social reproduction, also the sphere of culture, also the sphere of politics and geopolitics. I mean, to a certain extent, I could speak about all of those as an extension of the capitalist mode of production, but I feel I want to use capitalism as a way of speaking about all of those different things in some ways so that when I do speak about the capitalist mode of production, I can speak quite specifically about the exploitation of labor, the creation of surplus value, and so on. I think the reason is not only analytic, although that's important it's partly me striving for an analytic clarity, but it's also political, which is I think that if we only or exclusively speak about the capitalist mode of production, it encourages us to imagine what I think is one of the unfortunate tendencies in Western Marxism to locate the only, or at least the most important form of resistance as the resistance within the capitalist mode of production itself, which is to say the process of valorization of capital through the exploitation of labor through the wage relationship. Whereas I think right now, even though that I never want to give up that as the key way in which capitalism continues to operate and produce profit and the core of many of its internal contradictions, I also think that our future depends on being able to mobilize people who are outside of that experience. So this includes a lot of workers who, in fact, whose surplus value is in fact being harvested through the exploitation of their labor power, but would never consider themselves workers as such. People on 0 hours contracts who consider themselves freelancers, Uber drivers, Deliveroo drivers, for one, but also people who are working for the state, for instance, who would not necessarily, if you said like you're oppressed by a capitalist system of valorization, would be like I'm oppressed by this government agency or by my boss, but similarly also then making the links between capitalist exploitation of the wage labor or the wage relation and people who are resisting capitalist enclosure of lands, like indigenous people and peasants resisting environmental destruction, or people who are resisting extraction of natural resources, or people who are resisting the way that a capitalist system of alienation makes itself felt through racial injustice or gender injustice as well. And so that's why I try and use the broader term of capitalism to speak to the totality that the system creates. Yeah.
Thank you. It's 5 to 8 now, and we're due to finish at 8 o'clock. So I just want to thank Max for taking the time to speak to us this evening. It's really appreciated that you've done that for us. I hope everyone will go out and buy Max's book, if they haven't already. I've popped the link in the chat where you can get that from Pluto. Yeah, it's been a wonderful talk, and I hope everyone's found it valuable. And thank you everyone for contributing in the chat, and also the contributions that the other speakers have made. It's been really good. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me and for these great questions.
Thank you. It's been really excellent. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much, Max. It's been a pleasure to have you speaking, and we'll definitely upload your contribution onto our website. Did you want to say something, Fred?
No, did you want to make a plug for the next meeting in ACR?
Yeah, we've got a number of events coming up. We've got a members meeting on the 8th of October, and we also have our reading group, which we do in conjunction with the Left Book Club. The title that we're reading for our next meeting is Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. So it's definitely something that Max has spoken about. And we've also got a number of other speakers coming up over the next few weeks. And if you go onto our website, anticapitalistresistance.org, you'll be able to register for future events, and you'll catch up with all the latest news from the group. And if you like what we're doing, you like what we're saying, please do sign up as a member. We'd be glad to have you on board and join us in campaigning in the future. Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Max. I'll drop you an email, Max, and we'll talk again in the future, and hopefully we'll have you on board again.
Great.
Please. Thank you.
Wonderful. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.